Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings to the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We are in the classic Passage to India, and we now are looking at the two sections 4 and 5 as a unit, what have sometimes been referred to as the great rondo passages or the true Son of God passages. Now, we're going to comment on how really iconoclastic Whitman is in this poem and in this especially section 5 as we're about to come to it. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, our playlist there. And then you've been with us from the very beginning, that introductory word come, which we're going to see in these two sections, especially section 5 here in a moment. We've given a set of comments that were introductory to Passage to India. I'm hopeful that you have followed those. And we've already worked with passages 1, 2, and 3. Now as we turn to, what is sometimes referred to as the real Son of God passage, there's a reason why Whitman remains controversial even to today. And I think as we get into this section here, 4 and 5, we will see why. Let's begin first of all in section 4. For the last time, Passage to India will get used the way that it's about to get used, okay? Passage to India, struggles of many a captain, tales of many a sailor dead. Now, the word struggles, you'll remember from Open Road, Song of the Open Road 14, alongs those struggles and wars, blah, blah, blah. The idea of struggling is going to be central to our reading of Passage to India. And this passage, 4 and 5, this collection of lines, will in fact evince a certain understanding of struggle as well. Notice he'll say, struggles of many a captain, tales of many a sailor dead, over my mood stealing. You'll remember his use of the word mood in Eidolons, an artist's mood. Stealing and spreading they come. Of course, the use of the word come, we've commented on it. The very first word of Leaves of Grass, we're going to see it several times in 4-5 here. Like, and then it's an interesting simile, like clouds and cloudlets in the unreached sky. In other words, the idea of always looking for the next journey. Along all history, down, and you'll remember the word history into a historian, right? I project the history of the future. Along all history, down the slopes, as a rivulet running, of course autumn rivulets comes to mind, sinking now and now again to the surface, rising. I think this word, he used it for the first time in Eidolons, you'll remember it, the last lines of Eidolons. This idea of rising, the idea of the phoenix, as we commented in earlier lectures, a ceaseless thought, a varied train. And it's interesting he would use the word train, obviously talking about railroads earlier. Lo, so to thee, thy sight, they rise. In other words, it's almost like visions now start to come. The plans, again, back to Telios. The voyages, again. The expeditions, again. Vasco da Gama sails forth, and our Nortons will remind us that correctly it should be da Gama, D-A Gama. Portuguese navigator, first European to sail around Africa to India, 1497 to 1498. Again, the knowledge gained, the mariner's compass, and of course, as Daniel Bornstein has commented in his classic, The Discoverers, without that compass and the invention of the compass, so much does not happen in the history of the world. Lands found and nations born. Thou born America. I'll remind you that his use of the word America is fragile. Only 92 times is it used in all of Leaves of Grass. So I Hear America Singing is the first really important time it gets used, but here again it is. For purpose vast, again back to the idea of Telios, purpose. Man's long probation filled, thou rondure of the earth at last accomplished. You'll remember rondure out of the rolling ocean, the crowd, the great rondure, the great circle, the great globe, the great beginning to end. That is to say, everything comes, you know how they say that full circle? Here I think Whitman is definitely playing that game. Now we're going to, in passage 5, hear that this use of rondure, in view, Nortons will tell us, in view of the unity of lines 81 to 115, that is to say section 5, it's not surprising that Whitman offered this passage to the magazines for independent publication, as we said in our introductory comments. Oh, vast rondure. Notice his use of the word vast. It can mean large, but it can also mean depth, as in inexplicable. Okay? Swimming in space. Now he's talking obviously about the globe. Right, now this is the beginning of the move to the universal, by the way, in this section. Covered all over with visible power and beauty, obviously the earth, amazing. Alternate light and day, notice our yin-yang symbol and the Taoism that would influence Blake and obviously Whitman. And the teeming spiritual darkness. He's used this word teeming a number of times in Leaves of Grass. Unspeakable high processions of sun and moon and countless stars above. Below, the manifold grass. I told you guys he's having fun with this title, Leaves of Grass. And waters, animals, mountains, trees. With animals, we think of the 32nd passage, obviously, a song of myself. I think I could turn and live with the animals. With inscrutable purpose. Again, the teleos that Whitman is playing with is that everything is to bring about this poet, this true son of God, as he'll comment in a moment. Some hidden prophetic intention. Of course, starting from Pomanak 10 is his first use of this term prophetic. I think Whitman was in that religious strain where he thought of the great artist as somehow prophetic. But all of that now, first it seems to me, my thought begins to span thee. In other words, the question of the globe. And now all of a sudden he's beginning to ask, what is it all for? What's the meaning of it all? What's the teleos? Notice, back to geography. Down from the gardens of Asia, and obviously the fact that he uses the word gardens here, and then later it's going to be Adam and Eve, and we'll be talking about Milton and Paradise Lost. I think all of that is significant. Down from the gardens of Asia, descending, radiating, and there it is. Adam and Eve appear. And immediately we'll think about Milton's Paradise Lost of 1667. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net if you want to go back and review our comments there. Then their myriad progeny after them. In other words, all of the children of the world. Now all of a sudden, notice, this poem starts to become incredibly universal. Look at all the ing words here. Wandering, yearning, curious. We've talked about the power of that word in Leaves of Grass. With restless explorations. Again, passage, right? With questionings, baffled, formless, feverish, with never happy hearts. By the way, remember its use of the word questioning in Song of Myself 46? You're asking me questions, I hear you, I answer, I cannot answer, you must find out for yourself. Baffled will take us back to amazing the multitude. And the idea of never happy, only use in all Leaves of Grass of that phrase, never happy hearts, with that sad, incessant refrain, wherefore unsatisfied soul, and whither, O mocking life. Notice, the only time in this poem italicize happen, and it takes us obviously back to O mio life, the questions of these reoccurring. In other words, when one looks at the globe, the Randur, one is forced to ask the ultimate questions. What's the point? Wherefore? What's the point, unsatisfied soul? And whither, O mocking life? And then the word ah. And now we're getting ready for his answer. And this is the heart of Passage to India. Some have argued it's the heart of all of Leaves of Grass. Some have argued that if you set out and started with the word come, the very first word of Deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, and you read every single word right up to now, which obviously we have together, that it's all bringing us to this moment in time. Some have called this the culmination of Leaves of Grass. Question 4 of the Who's. Who shall soothe these feverish children? The use of children is going to get used again. Obviously, progeny earlier with Adam and Eve. Who justify these restless explorations? Again, this was the exact phrase of earlier. These restless explorations. Obviously, the word justify is going to get capitalized here in a second. Obviously, it takes us to Milton, into Paradise Lost, to justify the ways of God to man. And the question of theodicy, as we talk about it in our Big Five, the last of the Big Five. Who justify these restless explorations? Who speak the secret of impassive earth? You'll remember the use of the word secret in Paths Untrodden. Who bind it to us? I told you guys about his use of hugging and clasping and binding. Here's binding. What is this separate nature? Notice capitalized to make us think of our Emerson and his classic essay. So unnatural. What is this earth to our affections? And then in parenthetics, unloving earth, without a throb to answer ours. Cold earth, thinking obviously cold pastoral of Keats's Urn. The place of graves, end quote. That is to say, what is the point of all of this thing called the globe? Yet, soul. Now he begins to speak to himself. We've seen this formation in Leaves of Grass a number of times. Yet, soul, be sure the first intent remains. Again, we're back to this notion of cosmogonic origins. Remains and shall be carried out. Again, passage carried out. Perhaps, I love how he uses this word in Leaves of Grass, perhaps even now the time has arrived. Now, many have pointed out that if you sit down and read all of Leaves of Grass and look for the phrase, the time has arrived, you'll only see it one time, and it's in this poem. And I think this is why Whitman said of this poem that it speaks closer to his own philosophy than any other poem, because here it is. The time has arrived. Now we're going to get this interesting construction of for, after, then we're going to get finally, then we're going to get the word then. So don't lose the construction here. After the seas are all crossed, as they seem already crossed, after the great captains and engineers have accomplished their work, we've obviously heard about these earlier in the poem, after the noble inventors, after the scientists, the chemists, the geologists, ethnologists, so in other words, all of the great scientific thinkers, finally shall come the poet worthy that name. Now the idea of the poet, you'll remember this in starting from Pomanak number 6, the poet of comrades. He's used this phrase, the poet. He'll use it 20 times or something akin to it in Leaves of Grass. Finally shall come the poet worthy that name, the idea of being legitimate. And you could make the argument that all of Leaves of Grass is in some ways an attempt to legitimate the idea of the poet as the great artist. And then he calls it 3 times now. The true Son of God shall come singing his songs. Now obviously, the most radical word maybe in this entire poem is this word true, as it's used right here. Because of course, Christian readers already know who the Son of God is. Notice it is capitalized, right? God is capitalized. The true Son of God shall come. I told you about his use of the word come when we began our study together, singing his songs. And of course, there it is. In other words, Whitman is going to consider himself a part of this idea, this tradition, of this continuation, this expansion of religious language. And then after and the finally, the word then. Then, not your deeds only, O voyagers. Think about the use of the word deeds as it relates to, for example, Goethe's Faust. O scientists and inventors shall be justified. And now 3 alls. All these hearts as of fretted children, again we're back to his use of that word, shall be soothed. This is what the true poet will do. This is the program that Whitman is suggesting that he is engaging in with Leaves of Grass. All affection shall be fully responded to. The secret shall be told. All these separations and gaps shall be taken up and hooked and linked. I told you about grasping and holding together. And there's this vision of unity. The whole earth, this cold, impassive, voiceless earth shall be completely, and there it is, capitalized, justified. So it's as if Whitman believes that he can move from his Homer and his Dante to his Milton and then expand beyond all of the great previous writers and artists and poets to argue for justification. And then he uses the language of worship in the Trinity, Trinitas divine. I mean, I can't tell you guys how radical this is for Whitman's day. I mean, we read this today and we're like, yeah, big deal. But in Whitman's day, this kind of use, adopting this Christian religious language, by the way, Trinitas is only used 1 time in Leaves of Grass, and it's right here. Trinitas divine shall be gloriously accomplished and compacted by the true Son of God, the 2nd time now, the poet. And then in parenthetics, he shall indeed pass the straits and conquer the mountains. So now he's using the language of Da Gama and Columbus. He shall indeed pass the straits and conquer the mountains. He shall double the Cape of Good Hope to some purpose. Again, back to the idea of teleos in parenthetics. Nature and man, both, notice both capitalized. Nature and man shall be disjoined and diffused no more. Harmony. The true Son of God shall absolutely fuse them. You'll remember this use of the word fuse. For him I sing, I dilate and fuse in the midst of laws. You'll remember this idea of fusing, bringing together. I told you guys this clasping, grabbing, bringing together. Wow. Well, what are we going to say about these 2 passages here of 4-5? Well, I think his argument is that the poet is the most important person, individual, or individuals within our society, our civilization. That America is America because of our singers, because of our poets, because of our artists. Think about the power that he says this here, and then what will transpire to follow in America, and how America is defined in so many ways by the great, can we say, voices of creators? that have done so much, created so much since Whitman played the game. This is why many argue that in a set of lines like this, he kind of pushed the door open to argue that the greatest and most important people in our culture are the singers of songs, the poets, the artists. Said to be, well, notice the power of a single word. He doesn't say that they'll be the Son of God. He says, the true Son of God. That made this poem very controversial, and I'll let you grapple with how you want to read it. At 3a, we've mentioned Milton, of course, in Paradise Lost to justify the ways of God to men. I want to mention a couple of other titles, though, that come to mind about the power of the poet. Our study of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet of 1929, and of course the great Virginia Woolf's Letters to a Young Poet of 1932. I think both of those are borrowing heavily from what is being suggested here. I want us as well to think about how Whitman is playing in that tradition of that game of Plato's Republic, and how that Plato argues the dangers of poets, because obviously they're the ones who can be the corruptors of society by virtue of giving a certain kind of song that can be less than harmonious, all right? And of course, we've commented on that at learnstrong.net. You can go back and run that to ground. Finally, at 3b, what are your thoughts about poets? Are they valuable? We've commented as well on learnstrong.net about Shelley's defense of poetry and his argument that poets and poetry are the most important thing in the history of the world. Well, obviously, Whitman is playing around with a very similar kind of game. What do you make of his use of this phrase, the true Son of God? And how do you read that? I mean, do you read that as anti-somehow Christian language? Or do you see this as incredibly inclusive and a continuation of the Christian ideal of harmony and unity as it comes about through the great idea of the poet? And finally, do you think of Whitman as maybe a true Son of God in his prophetic tendencies towards challenging his own soul and then by definition all of us to somehow grow? Can we say that? Well, let's get on to passage 6 and see what radical thing he moves to next. Thank you.